When someone dies in the custody of Texas law enforcement, state law requires that agency to submit a specific report to the Attorney General detailing the incident. The report is meant to promote transparency and accountability. But a KXAN investigation found hundreds of reports in recent years filed incomplete or late, leaving the public and families without answers. Today on a special edition of Inside the Investigation, we take a closer look from the vault at our team's project, Dead and Undone.
Hello and welcome to a From the Vault edition of Inside the Investigation. I'm KXAN Director of Investigations and Innovation, Josh Hinkle, joined by my colleague on the investigative team, Senior Investigative Producer David Barrier. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about our team's past report from way back in 2020, Dead and Undone. This was all about people who were dying in law enforcement custody. That could have been if during an arrest, or it could have been in jail. Specifically, we were looking at the reporting requirements that law enforcement agencies were supposed to do when someone dies. They have to submit what's called a custodial death report to the Attorney General, and this is required by law. Right now, the law says that agencies have to submit a report to the Texas Attorney General's office providing details about the death and what caused it. The reports will be public, and there's a penalty for failing to file them, a Class B misdemeanor punishable by up to 180 days in jail. And the law also requires that reports are supposed to be submitted within today 30 days of that death. So we found that wasn't always happening, and there were some other problems with the reporting requirements, right?
Right, yeah. So just to give a little background on the law, as you said, these reports are required to be filed within 30 days. That was originally 20, and for this report, we caught up with the original lawmaker that passed the law. His name was Walter Martinez, and he's a Democrat out of San Antonio who represented a district down there in the 80s. And he brought this law up because of what he described as a dark time in law enforcement in Texas in terms of transparency. And back then in the 80s, there was no centralized reporting requirement or agency that gathered information on people who had died in custody. So as you may know, there are 254 counties. There are hundreds and hundreds of smaller law enforcement agencies across the state. And it was extremely difficult back then to get any, accounting, an overall accounting of how many people were dying in custody. And he said that it was possible for deaths to be swept under the rug. So he brought this law forward to create a centralized agency that would keep all the custodial death reports. That's the Office of Attorney General. And he passed that law. He said he wanted to improve upon it, but he ended up only having one term in office. So he never did get to come back around to improve the law the way that he wanted. And what we found was that there were many, many instances of law enforcement agencies that were not following the law. And on top of that, there was no repercussions for them at all. We saw that there was that Class B misdemeanor. We reached out to several of the largest counties where we found that there were lapses in this reporting requirement, and there had never been an instance of the repercussions happening of the Class B misdemeanor being used. And the experts that we talked to said that for the law to be used, for those repercussions or that punishment to happen, a district attorney or a county attorney would have to bring a charge essentially against a law enforcement official in their own, community, and that no one has ever been willing to do that. So we discovered that issue with it.
Yeah, and we're talking about hundreds of cases where the custodial death report either wasn't filed, or it was filed late, or it was incomplete, missing something like an autopsy report, which would be really important for transparency, especially if you're thinking about filing a wrongful death lawsuit, or you're tracking, trends in deaths in a particular jail or something. So you mentioned that the lawmaker was not reelected, and so it kind of fell by the wayside, I think. And then we flash forward to 2020 when we did this investigation. We talked to then Austin Democratic Representative Eddie Rodriguez because he has a criminal justice interest, and also the Travis County Jail is in his district, and we were finding that there were some of these cases that we were focusing on happening at that jail. So he took an interest in the topic, and in the 2021 legislative session here at the Capitol actually filed a bill that would specifically look at the transparency and more information in a timelier manner when it comes to filing a custodial death report. Specifically, he wanted to tweak the law to where there would be a civil penalty that would possibly happen if a law enforcement agency didn't file anything on time. And with a civil penalty, that means they're trying to collect money, and the money would continue going up. So a law enforcement agency would owe more and more the longer that it didn't file the proper paperwork. And the Attorney General, with this proposed legislation, would have been able to sue for that. So those were some steps that he was thinking would help with transparency. You know, it did get a committee hearing here at the Capitol that legislative session in 2021. I even testified on the bill to explain to lawmakers the challenges that it creates for transparency, specifically when we're trying to report as journalists on some of these issues, custodial deaths. It was left pending in the hearing, and it didn't progress any further that legislative session, largely in part because it met some strong law enforcement opposition. You can imagine that the law enforcement unions didn't like this because they felt like it was unnecessary paperwork. It was possibly maybe a little confusing process, and there were other ways to go about getting the right information there. So you would think that Representative Rodriguez might have interest to bring this back up in the next session in 2023. Well, what happened before then was he decided to run for Congress, and in the Democratic primary ended up losing to now Congressman Greg Casar, and he has not been in office since. So no one has taken this issue up since the 2021 legislative session.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what we found when we were doing our report. Is that when we started looking into this and asking agencies questions about why they hadn't filed their reports on time or updated them as they were required to do, some of them started to look back at their records and realize that we were right and that they needed to fix the problem. Like you said, there were over 100 that were filed late, and there were several hundred that were filed without the necessary updates. And what that basically means is that when an agency files a custodial death report, there are aspects of it that they can't fill out completely at the time because it's very close to the time of the death, and that's the autopsy and the findings from the autopsy, like what the medical examiner says the reason that the person died was. So,
or the toxicology report, which we know takes months sometimes to come back.
Right, yes. And so they're supposed to come back and update those. What we found when they get the record, and what we found is that they weren't in many cases. For example, in Austin, a couple of custodial deaths the reports had been left pending for years without that information being added. When we asked APD what was going on, why they were left like that, the police department did update the reports, and they had some explanations, I believe, about systems changing and the people who were in charge of those reports. There was some turnover there. Nevertheless, that's information that journalists use, that families want to know, and that's required by law for a reason. And so those issues were addressed when we started bringing it up. And like you said, Eddie Rodriguez wanted to affect some change there, but he never got the chance.
And so we mentioned the Travis County Jail being in his district. One of the cases that happened here in the Austin area where we found that the autopsy report wasn't completely submitted after some of those additional portions of the report, the toxicology, that kind of thing, came back was a case out of the Travis County Jail, Herman Titus, who, if you've been watching our vault stuff, we've been talking about Herman Titus in a previous episode. He was a 21-year-old man who died in the Travis County Jail after sustaining severe injuries in a car wreck prior to his arrest. He'd been complaining about pain for a long time and ended up having a seizure in his cell and died shortly after. What we found was that the Travis County Sheriff's Office, which is the administrator of the Travis County Jail, didn't submit the full paperwork to the custodial death reporting system for about 3 years. Like Austin Police, Travis County Sheriff's Office, once we pointed it out, did correct the issue, but a lot of time had gone by since then. And that's some paperwork that would have provided some answers for people like his mother, Demisha Burns, who we have also talked to significantly for this issue. She said at the time that having that full paperwork would have allowed her to make better decisions, like should she file a wrongful death lawsuit. She did try to at that point before getting everything that she might have needed, but she said that lawyers told her that there wasn't enough evidence to pursue a case at that point. So she let it go, and the statute of limitations eventually ran out. She also says that having that type of paperwork would have at least given her and her family some closure, because she could have better understood what happened and that police were doing everything they could to follow the rules that were in place. You might remember she did get involved with custodial death issues through other legislation that was being filed by Representative Joe Moody. At the time, it was called the dead suspect loophole, and they wanted to close that. Essentially, it was a loophole in the open records law here in Texas that was allowing police to withhold evidence if a suspect died in their custody, essentially hiding that information from families, lawyers, journalists, forever if they chose to do so. Session after session, even after Demisha Burns testified, even after we testified about this, they kept bringing this effort up to try to close that loophole. And eventually, a few sessions back, it did finally close. So now police cannot withhold information and evidence in a case where a suspect has died in their custody. So we're kind of still seeing how that plays out. But, again, I think it just shows the length that families are willing to go to make sure that other people don't have to experience something like this, because in the end of it, it's all about transparency, and people want to know what happened so they can move on with their lives, they can have that closure, and they can essentially trust law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. We'll do this again next month, but you can check out From the Vault episodes online anytime. For David, for myself, thanks for being with us.
You can watch all new episodes of Inside the Investigation on the KXAN Plus Smart TV app every Friday. You can also listen to an audio version on KXAN's Investigative podcast with new episodes every Saturday morning wherever you get podcasts.